Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Jim Wise is a local historian, author, and columnist and reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. Jim moved to Durham in 1966 to begin his studies at Duke University. Since then, he's been exploring, explaining, and writing about Durham for the News and Observer and other publications. He has also published several books about Durham and North Carolina, including Durham, A Bull City Story, and Murder in the Courthouse, Reconstruction and Redemption in the North Carolina Piedmont. Jim has taught at Duke University and is a former editor of its alumni publications. So let's welcome Jim.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn, for the words from our sponsor. And thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here and flattered. And I'm very flattered that all of you turned out to hear what I have to say here on a fine, almost summer Sunday afternoon. Well, good. And certainly I'm glad to hear the news about the reception from Mr. Bryant, who is one of Durham's real treasures and has been a great mentor and teacher to me, and I think of him as a friend as well. So definitely commend that occasion to everyone. Well, how's this? How's this? How's this? Okay. All right. Let's go with that. Let's go with this. Okay. Durham's other founding fathers.
Sorry. That, if you don't want to hold it, that's probably what we need.
Okay, pardon the technical difficulties. How's this for sound? Okay. All right, well, our title up here says Durham's other founding fathers, though before anybody gets castigated as a male chauvinist pig around here, let me point out that I do have a couple of mothers in the presentation. You could take that as the double entendre that it is, if you like, but anyway, just to give an example here. Most of us probably have, for some reason or another, have some idea of associating the Duke family with the founding of Durham. I have heard that assertion made by some undergraduate tour guides who really should have done some more research. The Dukes really didn't have anything at all to do with the founding of Durham. They did have a lot to do with the founding and establishment of its economic foundation, but they were sort of Johnny-come-latelys as far as the creation of the town. But give them credit where it's due. Old Wash and his boys Buck and Ben did set up the tobacco empire and really became the dominant tobacco company in Durham's early days as an industrial town. Well, there was Buck and there was Ben, but there was also Mary, who doesn't get quite as much notice in the biographies and the histories, but Mary was there while Buck and the boys were out peddling El Bono Publico, as they call their tobacco. Mary was, or they were in the factory, as it was called, and whacking tobacco leaves into little bitty pieces that you could stick in a pipe and smoke it. Well, Mary was back in the house sewing the little bags that they put the tobacco in to go and sell it. So she was really an integral part of the tobacco company and getting the empire started. That the little farm-grown, homegrown Duke Tobacco Company that grew into a multinational, a trust, spawned the power company and the endowment and the college, and without which Durham, it's very questionable just what Durham would be today were it not for the Duke's interest and investment in the school. But so let's give Mary credit where it's due on that note. Now, thanks. Okay, but that's what the presentation is all about. It's people like Mary Duke, who had greater and lesser roles in getting Durham established and getting it set on the course of development and growth and redevelopment and reinvention and redevelopment that it has been on ever since the 18 whenevers that it really got started. People who play bigger or lesser roles in all of that process, though they very likely had no idea that they were doing any such thing at the time. So that's the way history gets made. You don't know what you're doing until after you've done it. And then for better or for worse, somebody looks back and figures out what you were doing and knows better than you did. But anyway, a lot of us know something about the Dukes, and maybe we probably know something about this gentleman, Julian Shakespeare Carr, the only man who has a building name for him on both the UNC and Duke campuses. He was a Carolina man, but he was also a good Methodist. But you might say Carr is the guy who put the bull in Durham. He's seen here in his favorite disguise as a Confederate general, which he never was. He was a fresh-faced boy in the 3rd North Carolina Cavalry, Company K, mustered out at Appomattox as a buck private, but he went on in later life to become rich and famous and very busy in Confederate veterans affairs, and so he got the honorary title general, and he liked being called general anyway. He was rich and famous, and he liked a little flattery here and there. In fact, he's even got General Julian S. Carr on his tombstone over in Maplewood Cemetery. But that's him in his youth. But anyway, Carr, the way he put the bull in, besides whatever he thought of himself, he was a partner in the company that made Bull Durham smoking tobacco, and Bull Durham smoking tobacco was the one that really put Durham on the map in the nicotine world. He was a rather flamboyant character, and had a flair for advertising, and after he got into the company, he would hire sign painters to go out and paint Bull Durham on fences and barn roofs and anything that would stand still east of the Mississippi, and probably some later than that. There's even an apocryphal story that Mark Twain came back from a tour of the Mediterranean and said the most memorable thing he saw in Egypt was the Bull Durham sign on a pyramid. But the name of the company wasn't Carr, and it was not Bull Durham. It was the Blackwell Durham Tobacco Company. It was named for this man, William Thomas Blackwell, who was described actually as the father of Durham in the first book ever written about Durham. This history of the town of Durham, North Carolina, embracing biographical sketches and engravings of leading businessmen and a carefully compiled business directory of Durham. And it goes on for the rest of the page, but we don't need to go into all of that. That was put together by a man named Hiram Paul, who had been commissioned to do it by Julian Carr. And of course, Carr got the longest description among the leading businessmen, but Blackwell did get the second longest, and he was credited as father of Durham for very good reasons. Blackwell, among other things, he built about 300 houses that were leased out to the hired help at the tobacco factory, among other things he did. Blackwell had come to town from Person County. He was teaching school in the 1860s up there. The story is that he had paid a surrogate to do his bit in the Confederate Army for him. But he got tired of school teaching and went down to the eastern part of the state with a partner named James Day, and they started dealing in chewing tobacco, buying it and then reselling it, hopefully at a profit. They were doing a lot of business with a guy named John Ruffin Green up here in Durham, or Durham Station as it was at the time. And in 1868, Blackwell and Day came up here from Kinston and bought shares in the Green's Tobacco Company. Then the next year, Green died, 1869, and the Blackwell and Day bought out the heirs and assumed full ownership of the company and continued making the tobacco that by then was going by the popular name, at least, of Bull Durham. Well, Carr came into the company the year later, 1870. His daddy, John Carr, who I'll mention again later on, bought the boy a third share in the tobacco company for his 25th birthday present, trying to lure him back from where he'd gone off to Fort Smith, Arkansas, a town out on the frontier of Indian Territory, noted for its hanging judges. But so Carr came back, got into it, and the tobacco business was really booming, and the Bull Durham was booming most of all. And Blackwell, of course, was making a lot of money in all of this, but he also, besides that, he provided the Durham tobacco industry its first spinoff from manufacturing tobacco, and that was to create a market where farmers in the area could bring their leaf once they'd harvested and cured it. They could bring it in and sell it to the highest bidder. And this was quite a convenience for the farmers because they could probably get a better price than if they just went door to door, factory to factory, trying to sell their produce, or if they had to go to Danville or to Richmond or somewhere else to an established tobacco market. They could just come right here, which was conveniently on the railroad, and and get a good price, perhaps. And it was also convenient for the manufacturers because they had a ready source of tobacco, and worked out very well for everyone. And again, started generating more income, more capital into the local economy that went into building up the town. Blackwell opened his first auction house in 1871, and over the next 10 years, there were half a dozen or so more auction houses had opened in Durham, just to give you an idea of what a lucrative trade this was, all giving each other competition. So not only were the buyers competing for the farmers' tobacco, but the warehouses were competing with each other to get the farmers to come in and do business with them. So anyway, tobacco market season in a tobacco town is a happy time because that's the time everybody's got money. Money is flowing, the farmers have it in their pockets, and there are plenty of people around to take it away from them. So he certainly did a lot to establish many varied enterprises. Blackwell himself cashed out of the tobacco company in 1883, leaving Julian Carr as its president. And he went into another venture. He opened the Bank of Durham, the second bank in town, and besides going in the business of lending out money, he got into real estate development. I mentioned the 300 houses, invested in a railroad, and he owned a horse race track, a fancy place that was a real popular weekend sort of getaway spot out west of town, or what was then west of town. It's called Blackwell Park. And it is now the Duke University East Campus. Unfortunately, Mr. Blackwell was a little too liberal in his lending policies. And in 1888, the Bank of Durham collapsed and took about 15 other local businesses down with it. And Blackwell spent the rest of his life trying to pay off his debts, make good what he had unfortunately done, inadvertently, of course. And spent the last years of his life as sort of a broken man. He actually lived mostly off the charity given to him by Ben Duke, who I guess was a generous soul or felt some kind of obligation to look after the defeated, since the Dukes had been Blackwell's biggest competitors in the tobacco business all through the 1870s and 1880s, and eventually got on top and eventually got hold of the Blackwell Company. That's that's in the future, and that's sort of getting really ahead of the story of the founding of Durham. I have to go back before Blackwell, and even back before the days of photography. So best thing I can do for an image at this point is to show you a map of what Durham, or the Durham area, might have looked like in 1850. This is based on the railroad survey map that was done when they were laying out the North Carolina Railroad. And engineers there decided that they were going to need a watering stop somewhere between Morrisville and Hillsborough. By 1850, there was Durham Station. There was Pinhook, a rather notorious inn and tavern and stop-off spot, a truck stop of its day, where a lot of drinking and gambling and other nefarious things. It was said that men and women took their clothes off and ran races with each other there. Up there, and then Enterprise, Pratt's down here, Pratt's store, a place called Prattsburg. And basically just all around was just open country property, farmland. If you had stood where Dillard Street, where Roxborough Street crosses Main, or any of the major crossroads downtown, you look around, you wouldn't have seen much of anything except open fields. But back in those days, by then there were sort of the germs of a town getting started. Durham has no particular reason for being here. I mean, the good farmland is all farther north, a little bit farther south. The first villages in this area, if you can, even hamlets, started up around grist mills on the rivers. And the rivers are all up to the north, and then New Hope Creek down to the southwest. But here on this ridge that separates the Cape Fear and the Neuse River watersheds, there was a crossroads. The old wagon road between Roxborough and Fayetteville ran through here, and just about where Dillard Street crosses Main now, the Roxborough-Fayetteville Road crossed the Hillsborough to Raleigh wagon road. And at that crossroads in 1819, a man named William Dillard, which is probably the origin of Dillard Street, he bought 450 acres of land at that crossroads, and then went about buying more land and acquiring quite a very sizable holding there over the next few years. Several documents make reference to Dillardsville as a place, so that seems to be Dillardsville, or Dillard seems to be the first actual name that was applied to any particular spot in this immediate area, in the area that would go on to become Durham later on, Dillardsville. That didn't last too long. Dillardsville, by some accounts, was also the name of a post office, and presumably William Dillard was the postmaster in that at that place. I have a list of Orange County postmasters going back to 1825. He's not on it. But that could be because he died in 1824 and wasn't around in time. But besides owning a lot of property, he owned a cotton gin and a cotton press. Cotton was a major crop around here in those days, long before tobacco got to be a cash crop. But the press was used to pack cotton after it was picked and ginned into a bale that could be put on wagons and hauled off to market somewhere. So clearly he was not just a farmer, but he was an industrious fellow who had to have been fairly important in the community. But Mr. Dillard, he died in 1824. His property got split up among his heirs, and Dillardsville disappears from the record. But it is recorded that in 1827, another post office was established in this area called Herndon's. And the postmaster was a man named William R. Herndon. fellow that I was informed right before I started speaking is a third cousin 6 times removed from my wife, which we never suspected. But anyway, Herndon owned a store on that Hillsborough to Raleigh Road, probably on some land that he had bought from the Dillard family at some point. And his post office was the only one in this part of Orange County at that time, which probably tells you something about what this part of Orange County was like if there wasn't enough other people around to have any use for a post office. But Herndon could sort of be thought of as one of Durham's founders, and certainly one of the lesser known ones. He figured into the story rather early. He not only gave his name to a post office that brought some trade, some interest into this immediate area, but he gave a house or building and an acre of land to a new congregation that was forming in 1830 after a revival at a spot along the Hillsborough to Raleigh Road. It was called Orange Grove, probably from Orange County, and I suppose there was a grove of trees there to make it good. But that was about down in this area, roughly about where Alston Avenue crosses Main Street. Now, Herndon was a trustee of the church, and he gave the Methodist Church this house to be used for a church and for a school. Some people in the area even back then did prize formal education. Well, that was April of 1832, and the Orange Grove Methodist Church did have a bit of a setback. 3 years later, somebody called Jefferson Dillard, one of William Dillard's kin, set the church on fire, and it burned right down. Jefferson Dillard set off for parts unknown, was never heard of again. Now, why he did it, nobody knows, but he might have had some kind of a grudge against the Herndons or against the church. Maybe he was sore about losing some of the old family property, or he was just an old boy out to have a little fun one night. Things got kind of out of hand. But anyway, the congregation regrouped very quickly, built again, grew, and thrived. 1860, they moved about a mile west and became Trinity Methodist Church, the oldest continuous church in Durham, right over there, where it's on the same property that it moved to in 1860 on the aptly named Church Street. And that land was a donation from another one of Durham's founders, Robert Morris. Now, Robert Morris had come over from Hillsborough. He was a merchant and a hotel keeper over there, but he moved over to what by this point had become Durham Station on the North Carolina Railroad in the 1850s. Morris opened a hotel here, probably expecting to cash in off of the railroad, and perhaps figuring quite accurately that the area, because of the station there, was going to grow and that business would be coming his way. Or maybe he just wanted to cash in on the Teamsters going by, just like they had up at Pinhook or something. But anyway, he opened his hotel, and a few years later, 1858, that's a very important date in Durham history, Robert Morris and his son Thomas and a fellow named Wesley Wright got together and went into the business of making and selling smoking tobacco. And that was the first tobacco manufacturing that was done in the immediate area of what went on to become Durham. They set up what they called at the time a manufactory, and they were doing the same sort of thing that I described the Dukes doing. The way you manufactured tobacco was you bought leaf that was dried, and then you would take sticks and beat on it over a sieve until it got to be small enough little shreds that you could pack into a pipe. Chewing tobacco was never a major part of the tobacco industry in Durham. Winston-Salem was where the chewing tobacco ended up being really centered. They called their brand the best Spanish-flavored Durham smoking tobacco. And in so doing, they created the very foundation for the industry that led to everything else that became Durham. So, how about that? What can I say? Technical difficulties. Okay, back here to our map. Well, Herndon either lost or gave up the post office. I'd gotten up to the 1850s. Let me step back to the 1830s for a minute. Herndon gave up the post office. And in 1836, according to the record, the job went over to a man named William Pratt. And the post office changed its name to Prattsburg. Now, Prattsburg was down here in the same general area as where Herndon's store had been. And was owned, it was also, there was a cotton gin, cotton press there, a general store, a bar. There were lots of those around. In fact, Prattsburg had a reputation, William Pratt had a reputation, sort of like what was up here at Pinhook, at the other end of the ridge. He was indicted at one point for keeping a disorderly house where gambling and tippling and playing at cards on the Sabbath went on, and generally people defaming the holy day and carrying on in ways that were not approved of by the good leaders of the Orange County Grand Jury over 14 miles away over in Hillsborough. But whatever the outcome of his being indicted, he prospered, bought land, thrived, and was doing quite a good little business by all accounts. Now Mr. Pratt owned a good bit of land. Now in 1849, the engineers came through looking for a route for the North Carolina Railroad, and the story goes that they first went to Mr. Pratt because that was the closest thing to a settlement anywhere in the area, and they asked him for an easement to run tracks across his property close to his store and build a station because they needed back then steam engines needed a lot of refueling. They burned a lot of wood, boiled a lot of water, so they needed a place to stop and refresh halfway between Morrisville and Hillsborough. Well, Mr. Pratt probably knew something about trains, about locomotives. Whether he'd ever seen one actually or not is kind of dubious. But anyway, he set a really, really high price for his property. The story goes that the reason was that he was scared that the trains going by would scare his customers' horses and hurt his business. So he didn't really want the train to come by at all. So he set a really high price to make it worth his while, and the railroad people said no thanks, and they went one landowner to the west and got more favorable treatment from Bartlett Durham. Dr. Bartlett Durham, who is the namesake of our town. Whether you call him a founder or not is, well, I don't think he was interested in particularly founding anything other than his own economic well-being at the time. But anyway, Dr. Durham had hung out his shingle and bought 100 acres of land right between Prattsburg and Pinhook. Maybe he was figuring that having those establishments nearby would produce a good trade for his medical practice. But among other things, he went into business. He owned a store. John Carr, whom I mentioned before, was one of his early partners in that enterprise, where he sold dry goods and liquor And even though he dealt in spirituous beverages, he got elected to the state legislature and introduced a bill to incorporate a Sons of Temperance chapter in North Carolina, just to, I suppose, representing all the people all of the time or something. We don't know a whole lot about Dr. Durham. We don't know where he got his medical training. There's an account that he spent a year at the University of Pennsylvania. The University of Pennsylvania has no record of it. He probably just read medicine the way other people would read law as sort of an apprentice to an established physician. But he bought the land, and he was agreeable to letting the railroad come across it. So 1853, the post office changed names again and became Durham's post office. William Pratt continued as the postmaster, but now he had to walk from his store up to what became Durham Station. Now this is not to scale. This is not to scale exactly, but that's the Durham Station site. And you see the way this is the railroad right-of-way. It's making this, it comes into town from Morrisville down this way and makes this curve. Normally you would think it would have just made one curve like that, but this is there to this day to get around the Pratt property, because Pratt wouldn't let him wouldn't let them run tracks across his land. So, but what little we do know about Dr. Durham, well, he's called the founder of Durham. His tombstone, he's got a nice marker over in Maplewood Cemetery. They dug him up where he was first buried. He was buried at his mother's old family graveyard down on the line between Orange and Chatham County, the old Snipes family graveyard. But in 1933, folks in Durham was a big enough town, they figured that they really ought to have a founder and do something to commemorate the namesake, so they had him dug up and moved over here and implanted again in Maplewood Cemetery with a nice big marker and a lot of space all around it. It says founder City of Durham. Well, as I mentioned, he wasn't out to found anything. He gave his name, and he let the railroad use some of his property to set up a station. And he got his name on the post office. He was not a postmaster, by the way, just to keep that record straight. But it says that, and it also has his year of birth, year of death, and middle name wrong. But, it's the thought that counts. And so Dr. Durham is remembered and commemorated over in one of the city's two cemeteries over there. But what we do know about Dr. Durham, in large part, comes from this gentleman, Thaddeus Redmond, who was an illegitimate son of William Pratt. He was a little boy at the time Dr. Durham was practicing, and he remembered the doctor very well. He remembered that the doctor liked to get drunk and go around serenading the town, such as it was, with some of the other good old boys. They'd get some whiskey and some horns and something to drum on and go around and keep things very, very lively. He also remembered that Dr. Durham really cared about his patients. He really got into his medical business. He was, I guess, a very sensitive man. And Thaddeus Redmond, as a young boy, was very seriously ill. I believe he had scarlet fever, and Dr. Durham treated him, and nothing worked, and he just gave him up for dead. Fortunately, Thaddeus did live, but when something like that happened, when Dr. Durham had to give up on one of his patients, the story was that he would disappear and drown his sorrows for a couple of weeks and wouldn't be seen again. But unfortunately, Dr. Durham didn't live to see much of anything develop out of his donation or his sale to the North Carolina Railroad, because he died in 1859 and left a paternity suit behind him that was eventually tossed out. So give a little credit to Thad Redmond. He didn't have anything to do directly with founding Durham, but he did record some memories of the early days, and he was a direct connection between the future Durham and William Pratt, the somehow infamous or perhaps sorely mistaken William Pratt. Oddly enough, Pratt didn't sit down in his store and sulk after things started happening farther up the line at Durham's. He started buying property up there and watched the property values rise and rise and rise as the railroad got closer and closer and closer to being actually completed to this point. Now, well, Pratt wasn't the only one interested in the property around Durham Station. In the 1850s, there was this gentleman who was really set out to be a founder, John A. McMahon. He was an enterprising fellow. He was a Methodist, lay Methodist circuit rider, and we see him here on his horse, ready to go spread the word to the brush arbors and country churches and wherever would receive him. Besides that, he was a very devout man, and at one point early in his career, 1840s, he had an idea for something perhaps to help his evangelism. But he sketched out a picture and had it engraved. It depicted on one side the fate of the sinners in the afterlife, the other side the fates of the saved, the saints. And he had it printed up in two editions, one framed, one not. And it sold. He made a whole lot of money selling it, and he took the money and went into the smut business. He bought a patent to manufacture smut machines, these gadgets that would separate diseased wheat kernels from healthy wheat kernels. Wheat was a major cash crop in the area at that time, so it was a pretty big deal. He made money at that and set up his business up on the Little River. A place now called South Lowell. There's still South Lowell Road out in the northern part of the county. And supposedly he named the town after Lowell, Massachusetts, which was a flourishing cotton manufacturing town up in Massachusetts at the time, in the expectation and the hope that South Lowell would become a similar sort of factory town up on the Little River, and that he would be its prime mover, perhaps its founder there. It was a pretty thriving little community, but the railroad came through several miles to the south, and he saw an opportunity, and he got an option on 100 acres of land down close to Durham Station in the 1840s, and he put an advertisement in the Hillsborough paper for building lots, and even headed the ad, founding of a town. And he advertised the lots for sale, and but he did put a condition that nobody who owned property bought property from him could sell liquor. And he didn't have any takers. And so that idea went by the boards, and so Durham did not become McMahon's. We do still have in his memory McMahon Methodist Church out on Neal Road, but the town did not become McMahon's. In fact, his adventure with trying to found the town actually led to his going bankrupt because he had never actually paid for the land that he bought from Dr. Durham, and after Dr. Durham died, Durham's heirs tried to sued to get it back from him, and he lost what he had put in, and he had overexpanded his smut business and other enterprises. So he had a few hard years, but did manage to land back on his feet. But so, John McMahon. He certainly deserves credit, if nothing else, for drawing interest and advertising, promoting this area as a place with a future. a place that people might be very interested to move and settle and open businesses as long as the business had something to do with whiskey. Now, having the station, Durham Station here, made the place sort of important in a sort of crossroads village, growing about 100 people by 1860. And then in 1865, a notable visitor came through town, General William Tecumseh Sherman, and you could almost think of General Sherman as a founder of Durham. He certainly had no such thing in mind, but his presence in the area did have something to do with the later growth of a town and an industrial basis for it. Well, General Sherman was headquartered in Raleigh. His advance line in 1865, while he was negotiating with General Johnston about the biggest Confederate surrender of the war between the states, his advance line ran through Durham Station, West Point on the Eno, down through Durham Station to Chapel Hill to Tyrrell's Mountain down in Chatham County. And so there were a lot of soldiers sitting around in this area with nothing to do for several days, and a number of them took it upon themselves to go looking for some tobacco, and they liberated the entire stock in the warehouse of a man named John Ruffin Green. His warehouse happened to sit conveniently right next to the depot, right over where the old Bull building in the American Tobacco Complex is now. And he thought, Mr. Green thought that he was ruined, but turned out very well for him. Now he had come down to Durham after his first tobacco manufactory burned up northern part of the county. He bought the Morris Company factory and went into business of his own, manufacturing best Spanish flavored Durham smoking tobacco. And after his warehouse got liberated, and everybody went back home, he started getting letters wanting to know where people could get some more of that good tobacco, good Durham tobacco. And sure enough, they were willing to pay for it, and so all of a sudden he had a boom on his hands. And so later, very quickly, he decided that he needed a trademark or something to identify his Durham tobacco from everybody else's Durham tobacco, and so he picked a bull off the emblem on a jar of Coleman's mustard. And if you go look for Coleman's mustard in the grocery store, the label is still the same thing as it was back in 1866. And it's got a bull on it, and the bull is identified as being of a breed called Durham. So sort of a natural thing, but aside from whatever contribution Julian Carr made to putting the bull in Durham, the original bull came from Mr. Green. Mr. Green's company did very well. He needed to expand, and that was how Blackwell and Day came to buy into the company, and things just started popping. A lot of people suddenly realized there was a market for Durham tobacco and got into the manufacturing Durham tobacco of some kind of tobacco that could trade on the name of Durham. In fact, eventually, Morris sued Blackwell for infringing on his trademark, claiming that he had had the dibs on using the word Durham in tobacco. Eventually, that fell through, but it did provide for several years of litigation in the early 1870s, while Bull Durham was becoming the most popular smoking tobacco in the United States, and even getting shipped overseas. You know, Durham was playing in the global economy even as early as the 1870s. Things were going so well that Blackwell Company built a brick factory of several stories high, which is still standing, or part of it, the old Bull building, built in 1874, and for a while it was considered the biggest tobacco manufacturing facility anywhere in the world. People with enterprise going on, with business starting, with money to be made, people started gravitating to Durham to take advantage of the situation. Now, these were post-Civil War days, and the area around here was broke. Here was a place where money was being made. It was attractive. There was opportunity here. And so Durham started developing that diversity that we're so proud of and enjoy so much as part of living here. And another one of our founders here, Margaret Faucette. Margaret Faucette definitely should get credit for one of the founders of Durham and of Durham as it developed and Durham as it is today. This Faucette, whether she was a free or slave, I have not been able to find out. But anyway, after the emancipation, 1866, she came over from Hillsborough to the new booming town to perhaps seek her fortune at Durham Station. And speaking of founding mothers, Ms. Faucette had 13 children, so she definitely had a lot to do. By this, there was some African American population in the village before the war broke out. That's recorded on a map that was done of the village, drawn from memory many years later. But after the war, a number of African Americans, former slaves, were drifting into town, just like white people were for the very same reasons. Many of them were settling in an area just south of the railroad, just across the railroad from the main part of town, not an area that that grew into becoming Hayti. But Ms. Faucette apparently was a very devout, spiritual lady, but she began hosting prayer meetings in the rooming house where she was living over on what is now Pettigrew Street. When the weather was good, she and her fellow worshipers would go outside and set up a brush arbor, a little flimsy construction with something of a roof to keep the sun or the rain off, and hold their services out in God's great outdoors. This little proto-congregation grew, attracted adherents, and eventually a minister, a Reverend Samuel Hunt, came to serve the flock, and with his leadership, they got together and actually put up a building on Fayetteville, on Pettigrew Street, more or less where Fayetteville and Pettigrew used to cross before urban renewal and the freeway did so much of what it did to the Durham landscape. Anyway, Mrs. Faucette put the first dollar into the building fund plate for going on to construct what became White Rock Baptist Church as one of the two oldest and most prominent and really powerful African American congregations in Durham, the third church to take root in the Durham Station area. And that was developing along about the same time. The fourth congregation was getting started by this gentleman, Edian Markum. Edian Markum came to Durham Station, came south during Reconstruction. It's not quite sure whether he was born free or was born of enslaved parents. He came from somewhere in northeastern North Carolina. It's not completely clear just where. Probably in the Edenton area, maybe a bit farther east. But as a young man, he met some Quakers who took him up north, and his formative years he spent in Ohio learning to read and write and feeling the call to preach. After the war, he came back, supposedly may have come back as a teacher in freedmen's schools, but he came into Durham Station in 1868 and began preaching himself. Set up his own brush arbor again over in the Pettigrew Street neighborhood. This also attracted a following, and he went and that following eventually, well, very soon, put up a log building that became known as the Mount Bethel Church. Before too long, it affiliated with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and its name was changed from Mount Bethel. It became St. Joseph's, and grew to the point that by the 1890s it could build that magnificent brick building over on Fayetteville Street, which is now part of the Hayti Heritage Center in Durham. Edian Markum, another one of Durham's founders, maybe not as well known as he should be, but certainly one who figured very, very highly, very profoundly in the creation of the city of Durham. He actually left. He got the congregation started and left. Went off to be an evangelist in other parts. I suppose he figured he had done his bit. Accomplished his purpose at Durham Station, so he went on traveling and preaching, but eventually did come back and settle permanently in Durham. But he had given Durham the second African-American congregation, and the other major congregation that has proven to be highly influential, attractive, and important in the development of Durham, certainly the African-American community, but also the community just as a whole. And let's move on. This is a map drawn from memory in the 1920s. I don't know how well you can see it back there, but it illustrates what the village looked like in the late 1860s. Have here the depot, Durham Station. Here is John Green's tobacco factory. Robert Morris, he was back in the tobacco business by this time, but his hotel was right across the track from the depot. You see here sort of what was eventually became 5 Points. This was Morris Street running off into the original forest, but you look around and there are farms. There, J.R. Green had a farm over here, and William Mangum had a farm, and A.M. Rigsbee, another farm. Again, still, it was farmland all around. There was a town of about 250 people by 1870, but still, it was exceedingly rustic. You would think of in its very very early days. A.M. Rigsbee, Rigsbee name might ring a bell. He was the Atlas M. Rigsbee, Atlas Monroe Rigsbee, was the namesake of Rigsbee Avenue. He was one of a huge clan of Rigsbees, who are best not only remembered for the street downtown, but because their family graveyard is over right next to the east gate of Wallace Wade Stadium, inside a little stone wall. They were the family that sold the land to Buck Duke for what became Duke University's West Campus. And the reason that the West Campus is a mile separated from the East Campus is that when Buck Duke was thinking about endowing the college and fueling its expansion, a lot of people started buying land around East Campus, what was then Trinity College, expecting it was going to accelerate really in price. Buck Duke didn't care much for that idea, and because he was a slick businessman, he went a mile west, bought some cheap farmland, and set the college up over there. But that's getting way, way beyond the scope of this story. But anyway, Atlas Rigsbee was part of that clan. He was another saloon keeper. There were a lot in the 1860s. It's recorded that there were within the village there were at first 2 churches and 11 saloons. So that Durham's image as a rough and rowdy town does have some basis in fact. But Rigsbee was one of those. He went eventually, once the city was incorporated, town was incorporated in 1869. He became one of the first aldermen. As did William William Mangum, who owned a farm right over there. If you've been around Durham any time at all, you probably run into dozens of Mangums. It's a big family. Actually, the village of Bahama up in northern part of the county is named for three founding families, Ball, Harris, and Mangum, Bahama. And Durham actually was almost called Mangum when they got around to picking a name and incorporating the town in 1869. It was actually first incorporated in 1867, but then the Reconstruction Congress passed an act making null and void any action of a state government of a state that formerly in a condition of rebellion, and they had to go through the whole thing again 2 years later. But so 1869 is the date of the founding on Durham's seal. But it was a common name, but it wasn't William Mangum that they had in mind. It was this man, Willie Preston Mangum. This portrait of him was painted while he was president of pro tem of the United States Senate. William Preston Mangum lived up in the northern part of the county, sort of between what is now Bahama and Rougemont. He was a major landowner, a major figure, prominent in public affairs. He was elected to Congress in the 1820s and then elected to the Senate in 1831, served until 1836 when he resigned in dispute with his Whig party politics. But he ran again and was elected in 1840, and in 1842 he became president pro tem. Clearly a very distinguished man, a man very well thought of by his colleagues in Washington as well as by the voters of Orange County. In fact, he is as close as Durham has ever come to having a president, because when he was under the rules in the 1840s, the president pro tem was the third in line of the presidency. John Tyler had been elected vice president in 1840 along with William Henry Harrison. Harrison died in office a month after he was inaugurated. Tyler became president. There was no vice president, and that moved Willie P. Mangum into position number 2. Tyler was out visiting a naval gunboat in the Potomac River one day, and somebody did something wrong, and one of the guns exploded and killed several people who were in the president's party. Fortunately or unfortunately, President Tyler was not one of them, but it was a very close call, and had he been standing a few feet different from where he was, this man would have gone down in the records as President of the United States. But because he was by far the most distinguished resident of the area, citizen of this area at that time, he was considered to name the town in his honor, but it was already established as Durham's, and so the name Durham stuck and has remained with us ever since. Of course, Durham could have remained Dillardsville. It could have been Herndon. It could have been Prattsburg even, and if it was Prattsburg, I'm sure the nickname wouldn't have been Bull Durham or Bull City. It might have been Pratfall or something like that. So we have the beginnings of a town here. One of the most notable figures through this period, Caleb Green. Caleb Green, he was John Ruffin Green's brother. And among the other reasons that he should be noted was that he started the first newspaper in Durham. It was called the Tobacco Plant. He started it in 1872 to help promote the town and help its merchants with advertising to sell dry goods and clothes and property and legal services and whatever back and forth to each other. He was elected at a strategic point to the state legislature, representative from Orange County in 1880. And at this time, Hillsborough had the only newspaper in these parts since the 1820s. And just as a sign, Durham got its own newspaper. Eventually, the Hillsborough paper came to Durham and became the Durham Recorder instead, but Mr. Green had them beat. But there was some business was in Durham. Hillsborough was this sleepy old colonial town, 14 miles over there, but it was the county seat. And that was a lot of trouble. There was one train going once each way a day. The roads were not real great, and traveling to Hillsborough was time consuming, but if you're doing business, you had to go to the county seat every once in a while to file papers or sue somebody or do your jury duty or whatnot. It was very inconvenient. That would kill a whole day, if not more, just making the trip over there. So the business people in Durham, Proto-Durham, started pushing to get a county established, to get the eastern part of Orange County carved off and create a county of its own, and most importantly, to make Durham a county seat. Well, Mr. Green acted as the front man for them. In 1881, he introduced the bill to create Durham County, carving it off from Orange, which of course met a lot of resistance from legislators from Orange County. And actually the bill was defeated a couple of times, a couple of votes. But Mr. Green evidently was a good politician, and he got in the smoke-filled rooms and made one deal after another. And on the third reading, the bill passed, and Durham County was established in 1881. And so we have the occasional confusion when you say Durham, are you talking about the city or the county? Anyway, Mr. Green. Give him credit for being another one of Durham's founders, and for playing his own major part in creating the basis for a highly successful and thriving city later on. Okay. Sorry about that. We're getting close to the end, but mention another Edward James Parrish. He was the first tobacco auctioneer in town. He was the man that W.T. Blackwell hired to hawk tobacco when he first opened his warehouse and held his first sales in 1871. Mr. Parrish, as he looks here, a flamboyant fellow, he would supposedly he would do it so he would dress all in white with a great big Panama hat, so he would stand out. You could really see him. And when there was going to be a sale, they would hire kids to go through town with megaphones, advertising. It was really, really a big deal. Well, of course, the tobacco auction business got to be very lucrative in town, and Mr. Parrish, among others, went into that, and he did very well for a while. Unfortunately, he overexpanded himself in his own way, and had a huge reversal in the crash of 1893, and his brother-in-law foreclosed on him. His brother-in-law, who was a prominent rich fellow named Julian Shakespeare Carr, foreclosed and ruined Mr. Parrish, but who thereupon went to work for the Duke Tobacco Company as a salesman in the Far East, and made a very lucrative living hawking Duke tobacco to the Japanese and Chinese, and perhaps helping along the habit over there that I understand is still very widely enjoyed, unfortunately. So Mr. Parrish had another very prominent role. The election of 1888 it came right after Mr. Blackwell's bank had collapsed, so people in Durham were in pretty bad moods. The election was really contentious. This was before the Democratic hegemony had taken hold in North Carolina. It was a strong, a lot of interest, a lot of conflict between Democrats, Republicans, and a sort of third independent party that was representing labor. Actually, this is early days of the labor movement, which even got as far south as Durham in those days, it being an industrial town. Well, the Democrats swept the election. Caleb Green was chairman of the county Democratic Party, and the night after the election, somebody set his house on fire and burned it down. Now, this caused, of course, quite an uproar, and the blame fell on this labor organizer who was an African-American blacksmith. And people got rather riled, and some of the Democrats, white folks, went out and caught him and were about to lynch him when Mr. Parrish intervened. Mr. Parrish was probably a Democrat, but I think he had a fair sense of justice, and he probably realized that the guy wasn't to blame in the first place. But for whatever, he intervened and talked the mob into letting him go, and then even talked them into taking up a collection to buy the guy and his family train tickets out of town. So, a major figure in race relations later on, among other things, perhaps. But so, okay. But Parrish was noted for building a big brick warehouse. A lot of brick was being used in Durham in the 1870s and 1880s. And a lot of it, most of it, was being supplied by this gentleman, Richard Fitzgerald, an African-American fellow from a Union military veteran of the war. He and his brother Robert came south, settled over near Hillsboro, Robert to teach in a freedman's school, and Richard to farm and to perhaps do some teaching. But the brothers started a brick-making business. They were both trained as brick masons. They had worked as brick masons before the war up in Pennsylvania and Delaware. And they went into the business of manufacturing brick, and apparently they were very good. The brick they manufactured was very good because they got a state contract to supply the material for Central Prison over in Raleigh. And a contract like that really can make your fortune and put your name on the map in whatever business you're in. So thereupon, they picked up and moved from over near Hillsboro into Durham Station and went into the business of supplying brick for all of the new factory buildings and stores and whatnot that were going on around town. The brothers had a falling out for some reason. Robert started his own company and didn't do very well. He had always had bad eye trouble because he had a piece of shrapnel from that he had caught during the war. Robert is most noted because he was the grandfather of Paulie Murray, who has certainly had plenty of attention recently, attention long overdue, I must say. But Richard was the one who was really the tycoon of the brick business and took that money, and besides raising a family, building a very nice house for himself over in what's now the West End area. Actually, you can still see the gullies, the ground where it's carved out in that area, sort of near Campus Drive, sort of at the edge of habitation in the West End. That's where the clay was dug out to make the bricks that went into the factories and the warehouses and all of that. That's all over town, some of which still has the Fitzgerald name on them. But we're definitely one of the founders of Mechanics and Farmers Bank, dabbled in all kinds of other enterprises, as did many of the other African Americans who had entrepreneurial talents and were able to put them to work and flourish as the town went on. Of course, very well known about the North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, of course, the signature company of African American capitalism in Durham. And John Merrick was one of the founders. He was, of course, he's very well known as being the founder. And the story about him being a barber and perhaps getting inspired to move to Durham and go into business, given him by some of the Durham white business people who he liked his barbershop so much they would actually travel over to Raleigh to get their hair cut. But whatever, Mr. Merrick certainly one of the great founders. C.C. Spaulding, who ran the ran the company for years and years and years, actually came in after a reorganization to be sort of the office clerk and do everything guy. When the original company had some trouble and it was reformulated with Merrick and this other gentleman as the two founders of what grew into the company, and this is Dr. Aaron Moore, Aaron McDuffie Moore. He was a seminal figure, not just his role in the in the insurance business, but he was the first African American doctor in town. Records is that he would charge $1 per visit if you had it to pay. I'm sure, like most doctors, he would take payment in eggs or turnip greens or whatever if you didn't have any cash. He was from Columbus County. He was descended from free African Americans down there, the story goes, but he came to Durham and settled in 1888, that auspicious year, and got involved in business as well as his medical practice, and went on as a physician to be the driving force behind creation of Lincoln Hospital, which is the African American hospital that was established after Watts Hospital. George Watts paid to have a white-only hospital created over on the north side of the railroad tracks. Dr. Moore, who, like other African-American business people at the time, had kept close, fairly friendly ties with the white business establishment, but he understood that the Duke boys, Buck and Ben, were interested in doing some kind of a memorial in honor of the former slaves who had stayed loyal during the war and remained on the farm to help out the white folks keep things going. Dr. Moore went to them, and the story goes, said, well, that's a very nice idea and very generous, but what we could really use is a hospital. And so he talked the Dukes into donating the money that went into to creating Lincoln Hospital, which went on to serve the African American community from 1905 until it was incorporated into Durham County Hospital Corporation, and the operation became part of Durham Regional Hospital, or what is now Duke Regional Hospital. Aaron Moore was the man behind all of that, and he was the hospital's first superintendent. He also started something else. He was a member of White Rock Baptist Church, and in 1913 he started a library there in the Sunday school so that there would be resources for the kids and for the grown-ups as well, to have something to widen their own horizons, as well as having their spirits lifted by what went on in the sanctuary. But time went on, he felt that this should be made available to more than just the Baptists of White Rock, because some other churches wouldn't go into the Baptist church for whatever reason, and the Baptists wouldn't go into somebody else's church, sectarian politics being what they are. But anyway, so he moved the library out into a building of its own on Fayetteville Street, and that grew into what is now the Stanford Warren Library. And he even managed to get the city and the county both to chip in to keep it going, chip in financially to keep it going. Another founding element that went into creating Durham, and another one of our founders who perhaps isn't as well known as he really ought to be. The name perhaps, but everything he did, not quite as well. He was also one of the founders of Mechanics and Farmers Bank, and he had a financial interest in the Bull City Drug Store, which, as far as I can determine, was the second enterprise to use the name Bull City in its name in the very early 1900s. So there, another bit of founding that it is due to, in part at least, to Dr. Moore. Yeah. Yes?
Did that establishment of the Stanford Warren Library precede any white analog? Was that the first library in Durham?
No, the first library was at 5 Points, and it was started largely by Julian Carr's daughter, Lila, I believe was her name, and some of the faculty from Trinity College, which had moved to Durham in the early 1890s. That had gotten started before the turn of the 20th century, 1895, 1898. So that library was a little bit ahead of what was called the colored library at the time. And I could go on and talk some more about one of the others, Brodie Duke, who is a story unto himself. Actually, talking about Duke founding, Brodie was the first Duke to come to Durham. He tried to talk his daddy and the rest of the family into moving off the farm and coming to town. Old Wash didn't want to have anything to do with city ways, or for whatever reason. So Brodie picked up and moved in and went into the tobacco business all on his own. And he had quite a flair for business. He made and lost several fortunes, and he became sort of the black sheep of the Duke family. He was the oldest boy, but Brodie had three weaknesses. He liked women. He was married 4 times. He liked whiskey. He got drunk and dried out several times. And he liked speculating in commodities futures. And so he went broke quite a few times and had sort of a seesaw career. But among his other legacies for Durham, he developed Trinity Park, Duke Park, Old North Durham, that whole arc of land around north and west of what was the original downtown. That's all Brodie Duke's doing, even though his daddy told him he was wasting his money to invest in real estate. He donated the land where North Carolina Central University was founded, donated the land for Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church, even though the Dukes were Methodists. So, of course, Brodie was sort of a radical. But he was a silent partner in the tobacco company after he got drunk and rode his horse into the factory and started raising hell. The company was reorganized. Brodie was left a partner, but on the condition that he didn't embarrass anybody. So Brodie definitely had his point, but story goes that, like I said, he did like the company of ladies, and once his brother Buck came down from New York to have a talk with the boy about this lady that Brodie was fooling around with, and Buck said, "Brodie, don't you know that woman's been to bed with every man in Durham?" And Brodie said, "Hell, Buck, Durham ain't that big." So on that note, thank you very much.